My guest tonight is Mark Hackard. Mark is an independent foreign policy analyst. He has a BA in Russian language from Georgetown University and an MA in Russian Eastern European Eurasian Studies from Stanford University. His studies focus on the history of espionage and the relationship between political culture, religion, and the strategic issues they involve, which he approaches from a, I guess he says, a traditionalist conservative position. His website is Soul of the East, an online project dedicated to introducing to English speakers valuable aspects of Russian political thought and religious thought, as well as her traditionalist culture. Souloftheeast.org is the website. Mark, how are you doing tonight? Is that a good enough introduction for you? Anything you want to add?
That was great. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. So let's talk about Russia, East-West relations. What's going on? Maybe a brief history of it, going back to maybe the 19th century. I'm struck by a quote, Rudyard Kipling. Oh, East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. But Russia really isn't East. It's kind of Eurasia. It's kind of where East does meet West, and that's always been the source of the conflict, kind of. The source of the Russia. What does Russia represent to the West, and why does the West seem to always be challenging Russian power or threatening Russia?
Well, I think to the West, Russia, at least in the popular imagination, is something, of course, mysterious, sort of what Winston Churchill called, how did he phrase it, an enigma wrapped in a mystery or something to that effect. It's kind of intimidating, dark, wild. So Eurasia has this very I don't know how you would best put it, but it has a certain threatening air about it. The vastness of the Eurasian steppe and or the deep Russian forest. It's all to the Western mind is smacks of barbarism. But this conflict, as you say, it goes back a long time. We could of course look at the 19th century as to the real time when the standoff between continental Russian power and Anglo-American, which would later become American, but Anglo sea power really started. But even further back, there's long been this maneuvering and hostility between Russia and the West. You could really take it all the way back to, say, the 10th century with the christening of Rus, or the baptism of Rus, as they were then known, Kiev Rus, with Vladimir at its head. He was the Grand Duke of Kiev, and in 988 he accepted Christianity. But more specifically, and this was just a short time before the schism, which would occur in 1054, and Vladimir specifically took on Eastern Christianity, meaning Byzantine Orthodox Christianity, as opposed to Latin Roman Christianity, and he really aligned himself and aligned his civilization, Eastern Slavic civilization, with the Byzantine Orthodox culture that was then predominant, of course, in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so Rus, while being an independent power and kingdom, nonetheless was part of a greater Byzantine world. And this was kind of a magnification of the influence and clout of Orthodox culture. So to the West, that's always been a problem. And there were even crusades against Russia that were sponsored by Rome back in the 13th century. in order to quote unquote convert Russia when Russia was already certainly Christian, Orthodox Christian. The the Pope at the time blessed various military actions undertaken by the Swedes and the Livonian Knights and the Knights, the Teutonic Knights, who are a Germanic order, against the Russians in the Baltic region, and these various invasions, of course, ultimately failed. And that's also not to. I'm not bashing Catholics or attempting to demean them in any way. Certainly, while I'm Orthodox, I come from a Catholic family originally. So, but rather, I'm just saying this is a long time conflict, a long time confrontation between East and West. It's nothing new. It has deep cultural and religious roots. If we jump forward a bit to the 19th century, that is when the what we know as the Great Game really kicked into high gear, with the English liberal maritime sea power on the one side and the Russian more traditional continental land power on the other, competing for influence primarily in Central Asia and also in the Balkans, East Mediterranean, that area, which of course came to the parties came to loggerheads in the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. So that kind of is a brief outline. But once the Napoleonic Wars were done and France was no longer the main, from the British point of view, no longer the main threat to the balance of power in Europe, and Russia had marched its armies all the way to Paris in 1814, then Britain shifted its attention fully to Russia as the great supposed threat that needed to be subverted, undermined, its czar overthrown, and so it became the target of various intrigues and conspiracies and so on. So that, although really there are various instances of British intrigue in Russia, and it ties into Freemasonry, things like that, going back further before the Napoleonic Wars, certainly. But that's kind of a brief outline.
The Masonic lodges were kind of like centers or organizing cells that the British intelligence used.
Yes,
yeah,
that's exactly right, and that ties in not only to, you can see it not only in European politics, but also Middle Eastern politics as well. You have the Muslim Brotherhood, which really has its roots in Freemasonry and is tied, of course, to British intelligence. So,
yes, he's like an organizational design or method of subversion. Yeah,
right. Yeah. That is kind of the classic model. Intelligence is, as strange as it may seem to the modern ear, intelligence and secret societies and various cults or religions and so on really do kind of intertwine and have these common ties. There's nothing terribly that's just a fact of history, really.
Yeah, it's rings within rings and compartmentalization and things like that. Sacred rites and things like that. Right. Yeah. So it's okay. So we're into the 20th century, late 19th century, and we have this British geostrategist, Halford Mackinder. He comes up with the Heartland Doctrine. Can you explain the Heartland Doctrine?
Yeah. Sir Halford Mackinder was a geographer, and in 1904, he delivered a lecture to the Royal Geographic Society in London, and it dealt with the position of Eurasia, specifically the Eurasian heartland, which is roughly synonymous with Russia, and how the heartland was really the pivot point or axis of world history. And he showed that if you look at going all the way back to classical days, say antiquity with the Roman Empire and how it fell, it was subject, and even before the Romans with the Greeks, you have classical civilization was subject to nomadic raids from the steppe, and ultimately these raids became so great that they really toppled entire civilizations like Rome, which were already in their state of decline. But these great migrations of peoples and various invasions originated in the Eurasian steppe, and that kind of presaged the central position that the Eurasian heartland would have as the sort of launch pad for world power, just because of its population, resources, potential wealth, and its axial position that enabled whatever power held dominion there to project force in several directions and influence events all along its periphery. So that to Mackinder was really showed the future of where world politics would go. He said that this was of great worry because the heartland was industrializing. It would soon be covered with railways, which would mean that all that commerce and all that industry and all that potential power would be invulnerable to maritime interdiction, which of course was the specialty of the British, and then their successor, as we know, is U.S. sea power. So that, as we can see, is in fact kind of coming true today with Russo-Chinese cooperation and their kind of symbiotic relationship, and how the Russians provide technology and weapons, the Chinese and energy, whereas the Chinese provide investments and manpower. That's actually a great sort of combination to offset what the Russians and Chinese see as Western aggression. Mackinder's theory really was it's a very sharp analysis, but it's also been used, and it originated in the Royal Geographic Society. So it's meaning it's in London. It's I believe that falls under the Royal Society. So it's not at all far from the halls of power. It's been used by the oligarchy that has ruled the West for all this time as a strategy for increasing its own domination over the world. That they say that this has been articulated in various national security strategies in the United States going back to Truman, or you have, of course, the British going back further all the way to the beginning of the 20th century. But I think they proclaim the heartland to be the threat. I think the heartland is the target. Its vast riches, population, resources would need to be brought under control and subordinated in order for there to be a true world state, and meaning a global government. And as we know, if you've if your listeners, I'm sure they're well aware that the world state is the goal of Western elites who are sort of a financial international. It's not anything really nationally based. This is not to the benefit of really ordinary Americans or ordinary Brits or Germans or whoever it might be. This is meant to advance the interests of a financial elite, an oligarchy that seeks global domination. As James Bond-esque as that sounds, that's the case, and that's why Mackinder was also, up to his death. You have his last article, his last major work in 1943, being published in none other than Foreign Affairs, which of course is a publishing arm of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is run by the banksters and has been ever since it was formed in 1921. Same people that run the Federal Reserve, same banking families run the CFR. So this is the Heartland theory has been used as a means of as a stratagem for really pushing Western domination. When we hear the words international community, the international community is worried about this and that. Say, international community was worried about the violence in Ukraine and in February of 2014 before President Yanukovych was overthrown, but then the international community isn't really worried about the violence in Ukraine anymore when the new government sponsored by the West is bombarding cities in the East with artillery. That seems to be okay. So the international community is always just it means the oligarch ruled West, unfortunately. So nothing. We see so often the manipulation of semantics and all these word games that really just are meant to further the interests of a small plutocracy.
And that this ambition for global domination provides, I think, some explanation for the various wars, particularly the world wars of the 20th century.
Yes.
Put us in context. So you have at the turn of the century, I guess Britain switches its policy. Up until then, Britain's primary concern is France. Turn of the century becomes Germany and Russia, because Germany and Russia are developing rapidly. Russia is on its way to becoming a constitutional monarchy by all estimations at that time, and it's coming on like gangbusters. So is Germany, industrial. In fact, it's overtaking Great Britain, and Britain's suffering sort of, you could say, a relative decline, because you have the United States. So along comes World War One, and there's some speculation that Britain was behind the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand through the Masonic lodges in the Balkans, because I think the Black Hand had some links to British intelligence.
Yeah.
So there's some intrigue there. Bear with me, see what you think of this idea. I've run across this in my research, that what happened was that was more or less set up as a lure to get Germany to fight Russia. Even though Russia was the primary target of British policy, it was the ally of Great Britain in the Great War. But that's how it worked out. Russia was targeted because Russia is seen as a threat to India, I guess you could say, and Russia was too strong to be attacked directly militarily, but she was always vulnerable to subversion and revolution. And to bring about a general war, you'd make Russia vulnerable for revolution. So this happens during the war. The strains of war undermine the Russian economy. You have the conditions in St. Petersburg ripe for revolution. At the same time, Wall Street in London and Germany are importing Bolsheviks into Russia. Now you can see why Germany might do this, because they want to weaken Russia, and which they did initially achieve in Brest-Litovsk. But why would Wall Street in London want to undermine Russia? And what they did was they financed the Bolsheviks, and they set up the Bolsheviks in power. And throughout the existence of the Soviet Union, she was a recipient of copious amounts of Western aid, whether financial or technical. Yeah. How would you explain that apparent conundrum?
Well, you're right. There was a confluence of interest there that had the. If you look at the German side, you have the goal of subverting Russia, and that's why the Germans, of course, let Lenin through to Petrograd. That was also facilitated by the banker Max Warburg, whose brother Paul was in the United States, big banking family, and that had of course its branches both in Germany and America. The American financial elite and the British financial elite were instrumental in really bringing the revolution about in Russia. And this goes back not only to 1917, but you can see in 1905, you mentioned constitutional monarchy, that the beginning of this subversion really began gaining force back in 1905 with that revolution. That was also funded by people like Jacob Schiff, Kuhn and Loeb, from Manhattan, and so and then London as well.
I'm sorry. Didn't Jacob Schiff also foment the Russo-Japanese War?
Yes, he did.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's right. And the Russo-Japanese War was a major turning point for. He funded the propaganda of Russian POWs in Japanese prisoner of war camps, so that they would be the cause for future revolution. So really, you can see that there's the storybook version. We learn of official history that these revolutions just happened because the Russian people were oppressed, and gee whiz, they rose up and overthrew their oppressors, and isn't that great? And they started something new, and yeah, it had some problems, but wow, they had a revolution. Well, no one talks about or no one among official history, or it's often obfuscated that this was the result of subversion by the Western oligarchies. And so I think with the goal, why would Britain and then the United States seek to subvert Russia? Because Britain and the United States, as we know, their real politics is behind what's the essence of democracy but oligarchy. Their real politics were controlled by financial plutocracy. The real goal was to overthrow the Tsar, who was not subject to their influence and power, and who was not under their control, and had refused to do extensive business that would put him under their influence or make him financially subject to them. He refused that, and so he was then targeted for overthrow and assassination. And you can see the various connections between Western banking houses and the revolutionaries, including Trotsky, Max Warburg, J.P. Morgan, all the Colonel Thompson, who headed the Russia Aid Mission and then was known as the Bolshevik of Wall Street. The real goal was to get rid of traditional autocracy, the Tsar in Russia, and institute a new modern state that would centralize the resources and make them available for exploitation by international financial elites.
And that was the thrust of Anthony Sutton's research, more or less, regarding the Bolshevik Revolution. Right.
That's exactly right, and I think Sutton was dead on, so much so that the Hoover Institution got rid of him for his scholarship because it was stepping on the toes of its major funders, and that's right. That's why he had to basically pack and get out of there. Yeah.
And the interest there, from the standpoint of the Western oligarchs, would be if with Russia, with the Bolsheviks in charge, the Russian economy is now out of the game for a while. Therefore, her resources can either be exploited or sequestered, which
Yes.
increases the relative value of what they control at the time. And
Right.
so basically, they don't have to compete with Russia. And these are oligarchs, the monopolists. They're not free market guys. They don't believe in efficiency and best price to the consumer. They want to control markets. And I think Anthony Sutton said the way you get really, really rich is you don't go out and compete fairly with your neighbor to supply the best product at the lowest possible price.
Yeah, that's for suckers.
You use government to smash your competitor and take over government. And that's
right.
More or less is what they're doing here with the United States foreign policy or British foreign policy. And when you mention families like the Wahlbergs, this exposes the transnational element and the familial connections, how important these are, and how the nation states are just playthings to these people.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Nation states, as far as these people are concerned, are really just fronts for their power, and that's what we have to remember even in foreign policy dealings today. Mm-hmm. With the nations of the West, you're not looking at real nations. You're looking at corporate oligarchic fronts, mm-hmm. who are prosecuting the interests of these super wealthy elites. So really, when you hear in the news about, American freedom is under threat somewhere, you know you're in for the next scam.
Yeah. And of course, you can always look at the Second World War and the dealings, whether it's IBM or Standard Oil, supplying Luftwaffe aviation fuel throughout the war.
Yes.
Yeah, and this is so
nothing. Right. Brown Brothers Harriman. Mm-hmm. Of course, Bush was involved. The elder Bush, George H.W. Bush's father. Right. Wall Street was heavily involved both in financing the Bolshevik Revolution as well as the rise to power of the Third Reich. And I think Sutton makes a very good case for the application. And there are always people who differ in one manner or another with how relevant is this. But I think Hegelian dialectics, their application of that theory as a strategy does make a lot of sense, meaning putting forth a thesis, creating the antithesis, and then ultimately you clash them together and you control the outcome, the synthesis. Mm-hmm. So, and that's what you see again with these wars of the 20th century. You have there the First World War. Well, you have what's the outcome of the League of Nations that failed as a kind of a prototypical global government. So you have the next round of Hegelian dialectics, the Second World War, the outcome of which is the United Nations, and so on. So you can see the agenda being advanced ever closer to their goal of a world state.
And it isn't to say that these plans, that there aren't innovations or changes that they made along the way, because they're dealing with dynamic situations. But at the end of the day, their agenda seems to be achieved.
Right.
A good example is the relationship with Japan for the first part, I would say, but early part of the 20th century and into the 20s. Relations with Japan were very good. In fact, Japan has been described as sort of the cat's paw of U.S. foreign policy in Asia. But
right.
Then, as
and
Japan,
also British, yes.
But then Japan started to become a little too strong and ambitious in her own right, and that's when the rules changed and Japan became an enemy.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's how things, So they do have to change things up a little bit. It's not like these plans are being orchestrated or being executed flawlessly. They have,
No, and
yeah,
it's just the general, yeah, there's
yeah.
general drive for certain overriding goals that
Mhm.
must be implemented, and you see over and over they keep trying to the globalist elites keep trying to realize these objectives. So as a result, you have all sorts of wars and suffering and
Yeah, yeah,
various clashes of great powers and because just I mean human nature is very messy and you have all kinds of interests intertwining and at work and they're not invincible and they're not their victory is certainly not foreordained or anything like that. So I think it's just important to keep in mind that they as is said, man plans and God laughs, and I think that's the case with these people as diabolical as they are. Um, they may achieve some some summit of whatever their power may be, but ultimately it's all for naught. Sic transit gloria mundi, so passeth the glory of the world. So
yeah, yeah. um, so again, when we look at things like whether the rise of the Bolsheviks, Stalin, and Hitler, when we say that these regimes were installed or supported, it's not saying these people were assets of Western. Well, in a way they were, but they were kind of like unwitting assets. Because the way to look at British policy towards Germany in the first part of the 20th century would be kind of this 30 years war against Germany to
yeah,
weaken and destabilize Germany. Then they got Hitler, but then maybe they didn't expect the fall of France in 6 weeks in 1940. So
right,
what are we going to do now? So the plan changes a little bit. Same with the Bolshevik, invasion of Russia in June 1941, when German forces drove so deep and got to the suburbs of Moscow. What are we going to do now? And so they got to
yeah,
change things up. And how do we control the situation?
right, Lend-Lease and
Yeah.
yeah,
And in
yeah,
the meantime, Lend-Lease is going to Stalin, and Standard Oil is fueling the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe. And either way,
right,
they're making money on the deal.
yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah, they laugh all
yeah,
the way to the bank.
yeah,
And then of course if you see after the war, the push for global government is inevitably renewed, and you have people like Bernard Baruch and Rockefeller wanting to finally incorporate a full scale uh, global world state, and then but Stalin came in the way of that, and Stalin was certainly not a quote unquote good guy and killed millions, but a he was not an agent of these financial elites, and so he kept the Soviet Union from merging with this planned world state, and so his resistance, or the resistance of the Soviet Union to that, resulted in the Cold War.
yeah. And of course, then it brings us to the Cold War and the formation of NATO. Of course, the contours of the post-war situation could be very easily foreseen by the policy of unconditional surrender by Germany. Obviously, you're going to bring Russia into the heart of Europe with that policy.
Yeah,
And then that gives the pretext for NATO.
yeah, oh yeah,
Yeah.
right. It's the stage was certainly set for the new dialectic of the Cold War,
Hmm.
capitalism versus communism, and the planned merger, the ultimate synthesis between the two, as the theory went, known as convergence, and lots of people wrote about this in around the 70s. This was very much in vogue, but people like Brzezinski wrote about how ultimately the two systems would merge, and that work was being done to standardize uh, the two camps, so that the eventual uh, intermarriage of capitalism and communism would be seamless. And so that of course was the plan. It's not, as we can see, that also didn't plan out. So now you have a new sort of uh, conflict. You had that interregnum period, um, that was really marked by 9/11 and the so-called War on Terror, and now you have, unfortunately, this what can only be called Cold War II, or the new Cold War, as the media like to christen it. So.
So what you have, say, late 40s, you have this fear-mongering. I mean, obviously, anyone really familiar with the situation in Europe is Russia's in no condition to take over the world. She's been devastated. She's lost 20 million people. Her economy is shattered, by fighting off the German onslaught. Nevertheless, we have this fear-mongering. That's when Arthur Vandenberg tells Truman to scare the hell out of the American people,
Right.
to justify his Cold War agenda. But I have an interesting quote from John Foster Dulles, and he said this. He said, in regards to the Cold War and NATO, he says, in order to make the country bear the burden, we have to create an emotional atmosphere akin to wartime psychology. We have to create the idea of a threat from without. And then you have the National Security Memorandum 68, NSC 68, which I think came out around 1950. And in that document, it's a policy document, states that U.S. military superiority was a policy which the United States would probably pursue even if there were no Soviet Union. So it was preordained.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it wasn't a contingency; it was preordained. This policy. So we have the Cold War standoff. But as we alluded to before, this was largely for the rank and file, it wasn't a hoax. For the intelligence apparatchiks, the spy versus spy, and many people, it was a true conflict in many ways.
It was all very real, sure.
But at a certain level, Anthony Sutton said it was a hoax. It was a setup. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, in the sense of encouraging a new dialectic and really looking to expand the power of the military-industrial complex and the authority of the all-powerful modern surveillance state. In that sense, it was a hoax. That's not to say that as you alluded to, that parties, or rather that soldiers and intelligence officers and diplomats on both sides weren't working for what they saw as the interests of their country and seeking to deflect potential threats from the opponent, but really at the very highest level, you have elite manipulations that really made this kind of written in stone, that made the Cold War what it was, as this dialectical struggle.
It was more or less a strategy of tension writ large.
I think that's a great way to look at it. Yes, that the strategy of tension is more than just say various clandestine operations and intrigues and political fronts and different acts of sabotage or terrorism, things like that connected with the government. But you're right, the strategy of tension is something you could really apply to the direction of an entire civilization. Yes.
Now there is, there's a quote I found. You wrote an article on Kim Philby.
Yeah.
An excellent piece, by the way.
Thanks.
About his betrayal basically was a result of sort of the moral wasteland that was his country, the British Empire.
Right.
And fortunately, good observations. Throughout the Cold War, it was reported that David Rockefeller could land in Moscow anytime he wanted.
Right.
Yeah. So at that level, exactly. Yeah. So that's an interesting factoid. Make of that what you will. Find this quote here, if you can bear with me here. It's here we go. Kim Philby. Okay, Kim Philby, the spy, one of the Cambridge Five. He defected, I think, in Beirut, 1961. Was it?
63.
63. Big betrayal, because he was a big in British intelligence, also U.S. intelligence, because the CIA. James Jesus Angleton was his big supporter.
Yes. Philby was basically one of Angleton's closest friends.
Yeah.
Right. When Philby was in, even before Washington. But yeah, when Philby was in Washington, he and Angleton would sit and drink for hours and exchange
Yeah.
inside intelligence uh, rumors and information and different plans and strategies for operations. So
And I,
Phil really he passed all that along to Soviet intelligence. So he was really Soviet intelligence's their inner, oh, I don't know, how could you say it? He was their ear on the ground for Angleton's mind for a while. Yeah.
um, you close that article. Uh, Here's the quote. If I can, there's a good break off point. Just as Marxists appeal to the inevitability of history, so the plutocratic Western superclass quite openly, through theoreticians from H. G. Wells and Aldous Huxley to Bertrand Russell and Zbigniew Brzezinski, have trumpeted the supremacy of science to justify their will to power. The technocratic world state, a madman's dream threatening transmutation into our reality, would make the Soviet project seem childish, play acting in comparison. Kim Philby was doubtless a traitor. Levels above him, criminals far more grandiose, have been engineering the annihilation of the family, the national and religious heritage, and the very essence of human identity. Herein lies the greatest betrayal. Excellent paragraph, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
But that pretty much what we're kind of getting into now is sort of the meta level super elite, what they've been getting away with, or what they've been trying to achieve in the past, perhaps a few centuries, maybe even longer. But this might explain why Russia is such a target of the West. And it's not just that they covered her natural resources or her place on the map, because you mentioned earlier in Eurasia, she can bridge Eurasia, Asia, and Europe, and that, of course, marginalizes the United States. Because if you bring in the technical know-how of Europe with the resources of Russia and the factories of China, they don't need the U.S. dollar. And that
Right.
that explains a lot of what's going on with the pipelines and all that stuff. But that's just geostrategy. In your article, you say there's something more to this. It has to do with Russia's place in the world, her traditionalist culture. She's outside this monocultural corporate, monstrosity that's developed in the West. Can you go into that?
Sure. I think a major reason why you see tensions today is because Russia and of course we know Russia, just like any other country, is not perfect. Um, what you do see them standing for is national sovereignty, traditional identity to large measure, meaning heritage, meaning ethnicity, whatever that may be. Also traditional family, um, and religion, and all those things are completely contradictory to what globalist Western elites, to the direction they would like to drive the world. And so when you have a power like Russia not under their control, charting its own independent course and saying that, hey, actually we like our traditional values, we like our religion, we like our identity, our national identity. That if you look at what the standard line is in the sort of corporate controlled West, you have an unending campaign against any traditional identity and against traditional family, uh, and the erosion of national sovereignty. So that really enrages the superclass that holds power, in Wall Street, Hollywood, Washington, London, so on. So I think that plays a major role, and that unfortunately is the ideological battle of our age. And of course, you can see this elsewhere at other points, other regions of the world, but it's very much taken shape in this sort of new struggle because of because of the reality of Russian power. And at the same time, I think it's really a tragedy for everyone involved as far as normal people go, because really there's no use, or there's no good use. There's no reason for this conflict. Russia is not threatening anyone. It's in its own neighborhood. It as a normal power, it would expect that its sphere of influence is respected as a great power. And so really you have this strategy for full spectrum dominance coming from the West, from the Pentagon, and we just that really poses a threat to all countries' national sovereignty, including America's, interestingly enough. And we have to remember that these foreign policy initiatives and these misadventures and these awful, disastrous wars, that those are really not in the American interests, and the American people shouldn't really identify with those policies, because they're to the detriment of the American people. That's the sad fact, and that's unfortunately, given what the media is, a large portion of Americans are convinced that this is really good for them, and that getting involved in conflicts all around the world and starting various wars and destabilizing governments and subverting cultures, that this is really in the American interest. Well, it's not. It's not to anyone's benefit, but a small predatory superclass of really rich, I don't know how else you could describe them, parasitic oligarchs.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And they're so far removed from the concerns and cares of normal people that it really represents a breakaway civilization in many respects. They really, so they lack empathy, they lack normal morality, because they're so, I think, so corrupted with power.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And in my Philby article, I kind of talk about that. You mentioned kind of breakaway civilization, and the level of deviance is just astounding. And it's notable that both Philby and you have other members of the Cambridge Five spy ring, like Anthony Blunt, who were knighted. Philby was a knight of the British Empire, and of course this was before they were exposed. But it really shows that chivalry has been devalued and means nothing in our own age of inversion. And really, if you look further, you will see indeed that this means that nobility has been inverted, has been made. People, or rather the media and elites, have made a joke of even the notion of nobility, which is why you have rock stars and banksters and just cultural subverters who get these grand awards of knighthood and so on. Look at Jimmy Savile is the classic example I pointed out. Jimmy Savile was a confidant to the royal family, and was knighted and had every honor he could ask for, and wealth, and as we now know, he was a prolific child molester. And the supposition, which I think is a very good one, is that he was procuring children for the elites, for these various figures, very, very highest levels, who engaged in these really deviant, dark practices. So,
like Mountbatten,
Mountbatten, and you have Lord Britain now has been recognized, and on and on. And it's pretty. I think the word would be demoralizing or depressing to think about too much. But but it's a fact that needs to be recognized. That so when you speak about breakaway civilization, it's sort of a new height of deviance.
Elite deviancy.
Yes.
And what it is, and we of course had the same thing in the United States, kind of exposed with the Franklin scandal.
Yes.
Currently with Jeffrey Epstein, there's indicators there that this was like a kind of a blackmail, an intelligence operation.
Yeah, it always ties in with intelligence
Yeah.
operations. Same thing in Britain. Same thing,
Yeah.
right? With Franklin, with the Penn State stuff, you have very high placed figures there. Sandusky was the thought is that Sandusky was doing much more than just acting alone. So
Yeah, another procurer.
right,
Yeah.
it's really dark stuff.
And it implicates household names too. That's what.
Yeah, and that's why the media, which is, as we know, is owned by 5 or 6 major corporations. Why you're not going to hear about it, and you're not going to, or if you hear about it, it'll be swept under the rug. So it's too much for people to handle. As far as living, people who just go through their normal lives, it's not kept from them because it's too much for them to handle, but because it goes to the highest levels, and it would shake the foundations of the regime in place in the West.
Now, in regards to Russia, because what you're saying is Russia really represents, despite all her flaws. I mean, it's a big country, a lot of people, and it's got many problems, lots of corruption, and I'm sure at higher levels of state, I think they, despite Russia's difference with the West, is that I often think they have more in common with their counterparts than everyday people. But Russia itself represents just sort of this traditionalist non-West outside the Anglosphere. So it has to be neutered or weakened and destabilized.
Yeah, it has to be subverted. Yeah. The goal is to subvert, to undermine, to bring down Russian, to destabilize its peripheries and so on. That's unfortunately that's been the template for decades.
And that's why she's a target of, say, cultural or psychological warfare as well, like Pussy Riot and gay right activism and all that stuff, where I think Putin signs a law which is by any standard reasonable about not promoting homosexuality among children, which we should have laws in the United States to that effect, but we don't. We have the quite opposite under the rubric of sex education.
Everything's going in the opposite direction.
Yeah, it's transvaluation. What they do.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what's happened. And
yes, you have a logic of inversion at work.
So this gets into another piece you wrote, which was rather brief but brilliant. Manifest Disney.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Again, this sort of this. You go explain Manifest Disney. You wrote it.
Oh well, I think what I was getting at in that article, I mentioned that how best to characterize America. It is a wonderful country, and there's millions of great, very kind and generous people here. But if we really get to the essence of the national ideal, we can see that America was always an Enlightenment project. It was always planned as ever since its revolution, and even before. You can go all the way back to Francis Bacon and the New Atlantis as kind of this Rosicrucian type paradise state that the original technocracy he dreamed of instituting. America was always planned as a novus ordo seclorum, a new order of the ages, a universal construct of Enlightenment ideology, of liberalism, and so that means it will take certain forms in life, and just as it's a construct, meaning a kind of born from the mind, you see fantasies take shape in our everyday life, and as Father Seraphim Rose said, he was an Orthodox monk, and he died in 1982. And shortly before his death, he wrote of how Disneyland really signifies the essence of the American dream. This land of this place of fun, fakery, fraud, in many ways. And that's not to say that Americans are fraudsters or anything. That's not what I'm talking about. But rather Disneyland as sort of this place where everything's artificial, and unfortunately with television and the dominance of mass media, you do see a lot of fakery in that sense, and a lot of how would I say, lots of distortion of reality in order to meet ideological objectives. So Disneyland, Father Seraphim Rose remarked that Disneyland really represented the essence of the American dream, but that it was going to metastasize into the Soviet gulag. And I think that was very prescient of him to say, and it's unfortunate. It's very sad prophecy, but we see in our own day the erection of that's sorry really the bringing into place the entire surveillance grid, the NSA, that no one seems to care that U.S. that the U.S. national security apparatus is collecting all our data and tracking us, and now it's normal, and so we already have de facto a police state, or I guess you could call it a pleasure dome police state,
Mm-hmm.
if you look at the ideal of Disneyland and how everyone's told just to have fun and enjoy themselves and engage in all sorts of fantasies and fake enterprises and make money off of that, and it ties in very well with the idea of simulacra as elaborated by Jean Baudrillard, Baudrillard talked about Disneyland, of course, and how it was a focal point of simulacra. Simulacrum is a copy without an original. So if you look at Disneyland, it very well matches that description of these places that are copies. They're artificial, but they have no real reference point. It doesn't exist anywhere in reality, but it's nonetheless this kind of fake imagining brought into real life that has no direct connection with reality, and so Disneyland really is sort of the model for our civilization in many ways.
It's like well, you can make the same case about Las Vegas, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think Las Vegas today is a great. I think I don't know too much about Las Vegas, but I would guess that when it got renovated, say in the 90s, and they tried to become family friendly, whatever that meant, from Las Vegas, but I'm sure I could only imagine that they looked to Disneyland as their model of how to bring in more tourists and more customers, more families. Yeah.
Well, they are amusement parks, and amusement is, remember, to make you not think.
Yes, and amusement, right? Amusement is now supposedly the goal of life, really.
Yeah.
Or that's proclaimed to across the modern world, especially in the West, especially to Americans,
Mm-hmm.
is amusement. Well, that's what you're supposed to strive for, and you can that really is nonetheless really an extension of that whole Enlightenment ideal of life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That inevitably will be translated as when you put those ideals into practice, there's no higher connection to any transcendent standards, to any transcendent reality, and so it inevitably will degenerate into pure amusement.
Well, like you say, don't worry, be happy.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, the happy face civilization. So,
well, listen,
yeah,
we're out of time now, so
yeah.
listen, I want to thank you for joining me tonight. Again, it's Mark Hackard. His website is Soul of the East. Check his work out. He got some phenomenal articles there. Definitely worth studying. Mark, I want to thank you, and good night.
Thanks, Tim. Night.